Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Auditorium Professor Dr. Hashim Jalal, FPCI Secretariat. My name is Aisha, and I will be the Master of Ceremony for today's event. Today, we'll have FPCI Public Discussion titled Charting Indonesia's Economic Trajectory and Navigating Geopolitics, Georgetown Professor on Post-2024 Prospects. Ladies and gentlemen, as you all know, we have a very special guest coming all the way from Georgetown University, Professor Yuhki Tajima, Director of the Asian Studies Program. He will be sharing his expert views on Indonesia's economic prospects and external challenges post 2024 in today's discussion. To ensure the discussion flows seamlessly, we encourage all participants to please turn their phone notifications off. Now, ladies and gentlemen, before we start, please enjoy the following FPCI profile video.
Terpikir dan terpana dan terdiam, ku melihat sadarku bertahun bersama terwujudlah terbayang yang terindah, yang terhampar berlalulah sadarku semuanya perasaan rasa cinta kau yang diinginkan aku dari mimpiku coba terbangkan hayalku dari sadarku. Terbayang yang terindah, yang terhampar berlalulah sadarku semuanya perasaan rasa cinta kaulah yang diinginkan aku dari mimpiku coba terbangkan hayalku dari sadarku.
All right, during today's event, we encourage everyone here to please share your moments with us by mentioning us at FPC Indo on all social media platforms. Before we start the discussion, we would like to invite Dr. Dino Patijalal, founder and chairman of FPCI, to deliver a welcoming remarks. Dr. Dino, the floor is yours.
Professor Yuki and Ibu Renee, who's coming to Jakarta. They're going to be coming a lot more because Georgetown is going to set up a university in Indonesia, in Jakarta, the first American university in Indonesia. Let's give a big hand for that. And I used to be in Washington D.C., so Georgetown was really a top university. I love going to Georgetown, giving speeches there, and getting to know the lecturers, the professors. They always produce high quality analytical products. So it's a great pleasure to have you, Professor Yuki, and I encourage everybody to just listen to what he has to say, because the views of people from the outside usually lebih murni, more uncluttered, uh, than those of us inside yang apa, you hear 100 information analysis, uh, from where we are in Indonesia, and sometimes you just need to hear an outside perspective. So thank you, Professor Yuki and Renee, for coming here, and look forward to hearing your discussions. And now I invite Calvin to go up. I'm going to be sitting back there, so I don't intimidate you too much.
Okay, good afternoon. All right, before we start, I want to have a audience check, right? How many of you have been stuck an hour in the traffic? How many of you 1 hour in the traffic? 2 hours? Because how many of you taking a public transport to the office? There you go. Then this is the sign that the country becoming more efficient in public transport. So happy to know that. So today we're going to have a very good and interesting discussion, and I would like to invite Professor Yuhki Tajima to come forward. Prof, please come forward. Please give a big hand to Professor Tajima. All right, this is okay. Welcome to Jakarta. Welcome to FPCI, Professor Tajima. Let me tell a little bit about him. So Professor Tajima is the director of the Asian Studies Program and associate professors in the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. And Indonesia is so close to him. Why? Because he wrote a book titled The Institutional Origins of Communal Violence, Indonesia Transition from Authoritarian Rule. And guess what? She has Indonesian wife, and he has an Indonesian wife, and his wife family name is same with me. So happy to know there's a Chu family out there in the States. So he is very close and well aware about the Indonesian development. He's also a wide range expert of studies, from insurgencies to post-war societies up to political economy of development. So today we're discussing about Indonesian economy, global politics, democracy. It would be a wide range of discussion with Professor Tajima, and definitely at the end of the conversations, I will ask about the Georgetown plan, right? Believe me, this is not about the scholarship program announcement. This is literally about the discussion. So I would like to pick up his brain. Please stay tuned for 1 hour discussion, and I'll invite you to also chip in on your questions. Professors, I want to start with questions about the state of Indonesia. Let's talk about from the economic dimension and also democracy dimension. I know you've been watching the country since 1996, and I've been before, but you can see the transition during the democratic episode of the country. Now, how do you see it in the past decades, and how do you see it decades ahead? Professor, please.
So first of all, selamat siang semua teman-teman di sini ya. And also thank you so much to Pak Dino for inviting me here, and for Pak Calvin for moderating this, and Pak Ray as well. Thank you for your hospitality. This is my first time here at FPCI, and it's a true honor. This is one of the think tanks in Indonesia that I think is really going to be shaping the future of this country. And I actually, I've been working on Indonesia for the last 22 years, doing research, and I always thought that Indonesia needed more think tanks to be thinking about these issues in a sustained way. And I was so pleased to see Pak Dino, establish this institution, because it really requires people from the outside of government to constantly be analyzing, so that when governments change over, then you have that input, right? And also constantly giving them ideas of what needs to happen. So this is a wonderful opportunity. And the other thing is, I love the fact that we see all these young people here, including 2 former Georgetown students, right? So it was wonderful to see them here. But to answer your question, raise your hands, please. Desi, yeah. They were, and we hope to get more, so please do keep us in mind. So the question about where Indonesia is in its democracy, right? It's 2024 right now, right? 1998, when Indonesia embarked on this transition, was 26 years ago. 26 years from now, it'll be 2050. So we're exactly in the middle between the start of Indonesia's transition in 1998 and in 2050, when PricewaterhouseCoopers has predicted that Indonesia would be the 4th largest economy in the world by GDP, right? Now, a lot of things need to happen between now and then in order for those projections to be real, to be realized. But it's, I think, an opportune time to think about where we are, where we've been. So luckily, we've just had a democratic election, and there have been questions about, well, what does this mean, especially with the way that the candidacies have been formed, with different results and all sorts of other, I think, challenges that we saw in the field. But I think it's actually really useful to step back a little bit, to sort of look historically, but also comparatively. This is what I do as a comparative political scientist and a political economist. And so when we look at the different countries that look a lot like Indonesia in 1998, right? 1998, think about what Indonesia was doing. It was, first of all, in the middle of a financial crisis, okay? And in that year, does anyone have any idea what the average income in Indonesia was for 1 year? Any ideas? In today's dollars, Indonesia had $460 per year on average, which is very low because it was the year that the crisis had hit, right? So the amount of money that US dollars that each person earned was actually considered much lower, right? Nonetheless, okay, it recovered a little bit to about 800 by the year 2000. So that's still quite low. Now, the GDP per capita of Indonesia is almost 5,000, okay? So that's a huge increase. That's how far things have come in the last 24 years, okay? So that's the first thing to take note. The second thing is, where was Indonesia in 1998, right? So the former dictator, Suharto, was, sort of pushed to the side. And we started to have these democratic reforms, okay? So actually, one of the findings that's most robust in the literature on democratization is that if you are a poor country and you try to democratize, almost always you fail. Where you have countries that democratize at over $7,000 per person, they succeed, okay? They're stable. So think about the odds of what we saw this last month, right? of being able to have a true choice between 3 different candidacies, right? That's actually extremely rare. How did this happen, right? Because and no one would have predicted based on the statistics that Indonesian democracy would be stable in 1998. I would actually encourage anyone who's interested in reading about this. There's a famous book by a political scientist named Przeworski. It's hard to spell, but it starts with the P. And basically that was the main finding, is that poor countries that democratize go back to dictatorship. Rich countries that democratize, they succeed. So how did this happen, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is, well, they're a military dictatorship turning into democracy. The big question there is, what do you do with the military? Why would the military accept having the people choose who the leaders are? That's why military dictatorships usually come back after there is some democratic transition. Does anyone know in here a couple other examples in Southeast Asia that are similar to an Indonesian case where you had a military dictatorship that tried to democratize? Myanmar, yes? And Thailand, perfect. So Myanmar and Thailand. Now, what's the difference between Myanmar and Thailand and Indonesia? The difference is what they did with the military generals and the political parties. In Myanmar, all of the military generals are in one party, not in Aung San Suu Kyi's party. So when Aung San Suu Kyi's party won, the military always has the trump card. They can just get mad and throw the game board over, and then they take power through coup d'etat. Okay? Thailand, most of the military generals are in the royalist party. And so when the other party wins, the same thing happens. So Thailand keeps going to coups every time the military is not happy. Okay? Indonesia. Every major political party has a military general in it, right? And in the West, actually, we think of this as suboptimal for a democracy, right? But the difference is in the West, you're not coming from a context where it was a military dictatorship, right? So you don't need to figure out a way to control the military, right? So in a sense, what you have here is a way of making sure that the military has some voice or interest in sustaining the democracy, right? There are examples where you have a military dictatorship that then completely takes out the military from civilian rule, and that's South Korea. So South Korea was one example, and I think that's the ideal. I think it's ideal to have the military separate, but you have to think about what the context was, right? So when I think about the Indonesian case, I think of this as a very successful case on at least the electoral side of democracy. Now, there is a second side of democracy, which is liberalism, right? Are the people's voices protected, especially the ones who disagree with the people in power? Are minorities protected, right? That's what liberalism means, right? So that is a question that I think we need to be really sort of paying attention to in Indonesia, and we've had to be over the last several years. So the last thing I would say about this democratic election is so the Prabowo campaign, they were successful this year, but they had a very different message than the last 2 elections. The last 2 elections was about nationalism, ultranationalism, and Islamism, right? These are exclusivist types of messages, not inclusivist, right? And the message that won in those 2 elections in 2014 and 2019 was Jokowi's inclusivist message, right? So what I think of democracy as is a way to really allow the people to not just choose their leaders, but tell their leaders really what they want, right? So in the 2014 and 2019 elections, Indonesia as an electorate, said, we want an inclusivist vision for Indonesia, right? And what I think we see actually is, and what I'm hoping is that actually the inclusivist message that he got from the people, both when he lost, but also this time when he won, is that he should continue to be inclusive, because when he is exclusive, that's when people are unhappy, right? And I think that's where he'll lose influence in the population, right? So what I hope is that people will that will be his incentive to remain inclusive. That is what I'm hoping for. And he has an incentive because he has another election in 5 years, right? So that is the ideal. And if he does, I think it'll be a much more successful presidency than if he turns the other way. So that's what I would say about that.
Having an inclusive government also translates into accommodating all the political parties in the government. And I think that also yields into a small opposition. And that happened in 2019. I think we can see it. In 2014, President Jokowi has a small government with a huge opposition at the time. And I think in 2024, it could be repeating what happened in 2029. Now, my question to you, inclusive government, is it a worth to have a small oppositions, or it's required to have a good or quite a balance of positions? What do you think?
That's a really subtle and an amazing question, actually. So thank you for asking that. When you have this, an election, so you have a winner. Jokowi could have done what in political science is known as the minimum winning coalition, which is actually you want to only give seats, like in the ministries, to the people that are part of your coalition, and keep that coalition small, because then you get more benefits per party, right? So in political science theory, oftentimes that's what we predict is going to happen, right? But when you sort of do a super majority, like what we saw in Jokowi's previous cabinet, and what we are likely to see in Prabowo's cabinet, there's a different objective. It's not to maximize the influence of each of the different ministers. It's actually, I think, to maintain stability, because it means that the opposition has some stake in this government, right? And I think that's really what the main message is, right? This is sort of prioritizing stability over, being able to squeeze the most, right? And it also is a way of sort of co-opting opposition, right? That will not necessarily. I think you want to have a strong opposition voice, just so you can make sure that the people have different options, right? And if you provide them different options, then at least the president can start to get the message. Oh, okay, this message is doing better than that one, right? I think I might have to move more towards what the opposition is saying, right? So that's one worry about having too big of a coalition, but that's the political logic, which is about stability. Yeah.
Let's move the conversations to Indonesian development and economy. I wanted to pick up a statement from Professor Klaus Schwab, the chairman of the World Economic Forum. He says that a country that managed to have a comprehensive policy on green economy and also on embracing revolution in industry on technology would have a competitive advantage in today's global competitions. How do you see it, Indonesia, in that context? Because I'm checking the data this morning, and by the way, I'm not an economist. I'm just learning that international trade ratio of Indonesia is still below 50%. Comparing to Malaysia, it's 130%, and Vietnam 180%. So in that sense, it means that global economy has a minimal implications to Indonesian economy, except the commodities. So having the Professor Klaus says about the competitive advantage in these global competitions, and also looking to Indonesian economic structure, where we are, and how do you see it up front, and how the indicators that move Indonesia move forward.
So I think it's a really important question. I think one of the big questions out there is, how does Indonesia transition from being a middle-income country, it's a high middle-income country now, okay, to being a high-income country, okay? From 1960 until now, there have been 101 middle-income countries. Only 15 have graduated to being high income. Okay. In Asia, many of them are in Asia, right? So Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, right? So these are countries, Japan, right? These are the countries that Indonesia can kind of learn from, right? But also learn what not to do as well. Okay. But the most important thing, or most important indicator, as it were, is something called total factor productivity, TFP, right? So anyone economics major in here? No, okay. Well, total factor of productivity is the most important thing for an economy to have to sustain its growth. You can grow through three ways effectively. One is through education of your people, human resources. Two, through simply investing more. But if you grow through education alone, eventually you'll have what's called diminishing returns. So it'll start to slow down the growth, okay? So Korea is very well educated now, okay? But their growth is slowing because you can only grow so much, okay? The same thing with investment. You can build and build and build, you invest with capital and whatnot, but each new piece of capital will only return a little bit more, okay? So it has diminishing returns again. What doesn't have diminishing returns is total factor of productivity. So what is total factor of productivity? Total factor of productivity is everything from the efficiency of how the economy works, how people work, how technology is incorporated, okay? How the laws govern the economy. Is it efficient, okay? And if it is, then you can actually grow much more sustained, in a much more sustained way. And this is the main thing that I think is important for Indonesia to be able to continue to grow. It's through total factor productivity. What does that look like more concretely? Well, we need to have the ability for individuals to raise their human capacity through education, but also to then incorporate technologies. So productivity is about increasing the amount of output per person, okay? So when you have the right use of technology, then you can actually produce more on average, right? And that's what you want. But it's not the only way you can grow. In fact, the biggest leap in history of total factor productivity was in China, when they simply moved away from the communist management of the economy to a market-based one. So this is when Deng Xiaoping took over from Mao in the late 1970s. And that's what unleashed all of this growth from the 1980s onward. Okay, so the 1980s, it wasn't about technology. It was simply letting farmers to keep some of their rice instead of giving it back to the state. So then the farmers had an incentive to try harder, to find better ways of producing rice. So that's how growth can happen. Now, how does this look like in Indonesia? Well, there are a lot of different regulations here that I think slow things down for the private sector, right? That I think can be challenging, right? you want regulations that are rational. Regulations are good if they are, for example, keeping the pollution down, for example, right? Or protecting workers, right? That's what a good regulation looks like. But lots of regulations, in my experience that I've seen here, requires that you go from one ministry or one dinas to another dinas, and then one dinas has one set of rules and another dinas has a different set of rules. And it's not just two, maybe it's 5 dinases. In fact, I remember having to go from dinas to dinas to dinas to get just one little permit, right? I don't know if that's familiar to anyone here. Yeah, everyone knows about it. That's not normal. It doesn't have to be that way, right? So one way you can actually make things better is to coordinate on that, right? And make it much more streamlined. If you look at Singapore, so efficient, right? Because they have rationally sort of taken out a lot of these points of friction, right? So I think actually if Indonesia undergoes that kind of reform in a very pragmatic way, that will unleash a lot of things, right? And the last thing I'll say is on innovation. Okay, so if Indonesia wants to get out of the middle income trap, it needs to be able to innovate. And how you do that is you need to invest in your educational system. You need to really create incentives that make it rewarding for people to innovate, right? Whether it's getting patents or making researchers, be rewarded with world-class research outputs, things like that. And I think that's something that Indonesia still needs to work on. Yeah, so that's what I would say. Oh, actually, one last thing I would say. Sorry. I saw up here in the introductory video, it said Indonesia is a middle power, right? I actually think that in 26 years, Indonesia will be a major power, okay? Because it'll be the 4th largest country in the world. China, the US, right? India, and then Indonesia. Those would be the 4th largest countries. So by definition, it should be a major power, right? If they do it right. Now, you noted you're comparing Malaysia and Vietnam's trade, right, with Indonesia. Indonesia, as a percentage, doesn't trade as much. That's actually not necessarily a bad thing, I think. I think it actually gives Indonesia, the reason why that's the case is because Indonesia is so large. It has a major domestic market. And that is a source of leverage when we move to geopolitics. The same way China's economy is a source of leverage, the same way the US's economy is a source of leverage, because companies want to get access to these markets. So Indonesia also has that. How can Indonesia use that to its advantage?
We just opened a middle power status because of your statement. We need to change the name, I think.
Well, for now, maybe.
Now let's move in the needles to discuss about the geopolitics, as you know. And after this, I would like to open to the floor, so if you have any questions. My foreign minister just had a speech in The Hague commenting about the Palestine, and my director general for Asia and Africa Pacific, Africa and Asia Pacific wrote an articles in Jakarta Post. The argument was the collapse of the international liberal order and also the questionings of the faith of the West on international liberal order, international rules-based orders, and etc. etc. Indonesia has been commented on that norms since our establishments, and now we can see the Chinese and other Russia, or even it could be on the BRICS, making another alternatives with their own mechanisms and etc. etc. So how do you see it, particularly on the context of Indo-Pacific? Indo-Pacific now not only has the most progressive on economy, but also joining the 2 oceans is something that could be, we haven't seen an effective joining the 2 oceans. And we don't know what would be the effective way of joining the 2 oceans and what kind of implication that happen to the regional order. So in that context of the command of the criticals on the international liberal orders, and also how do you see the geopolitical context in the region, How do you see it this day, professors?
It's a very complicated question, but I like it. So if you look at where Indonesia is positioned, it is exactly at the intersection between the Indian and Pacific Oceans, right? Super strategic, right? Again, one more area of leverage for Indonesia, right? You have a large economy, domestic economy, right? It's going to grow, but also it's connecting these two areas. Just like Singapore has leveraged that position to its benefit, right? Indonesia can do the same, right? Now, how does Indonesia sort of wade through this, right? I think that's a big question because the US and China, they have their own dynamic, right? India has its own interests, right? Indonesia has to follow its own, right? But I do think, and it looks like through a lot of the policies that Indonesia has, that they have an incentive to maintain a free and open Indo-Pacific, right? This is an idea that Japan sort of put forward because they are worried about the ability to conduct trade through the strait, right? They're worried about encroachments from China, right? And I like to look at different periods in ASEAN's history, and one of the key sort of time periods was around 2012 to 2014. And this was the period in which China started kind of feeling things out. This is actually sort of early years of Xi Jinping, right? And it was a time when China really was feeling newly confident with its role in the world, right? Both economically and geopolitically. So the way it manifested itself was in the Philippines, they took over the Scarborough Shoal, right? And in Vietnam, off the shore of Vietnam, they put a oil rig right off the shore of Vietnam, which Vietnam claimed was its own, according to the UN law of the sea. You have 200 nautical miles off of the ocean, off the shore that should be your own exclusive economic zone, right? So that led to a clash between the Philippines and China, but also there was a clash between Vietnam and China, right? And you start to see these points in which I interpret it as, okay, China is trying to sort of see what these other countries will do. How much do these things matter, right? What can we get away with? But also, what will the other countries tell us, right? How much this matters, right? And during that time, I think Indonesia was sort of waiting and seeing, right? Because nothing was really directly affecting them, right? But so I have a research project that I've been working on for a number of years where it examines the public opinion in Malaysia and in Thailand during the time that that Vietnam was fighting against China over that oil rig. There were actually riots in Vietnam in 2014 against Chinese businesses, and actually the Vietnamese government was allowing them to happen for a while as a way to communicate to the Chinese, we're not happy with this, okay? So this became news, and when it came into the international media, then you start to see it landing in Malaysia and in Thailand. And in Malaysia, public opinion towards China went like this. Boom. It fell down. In Thailand, it didn't change. Now, why did public opinion towards China not change in Thailand, but it changed for the worse in Malaysia? And the reason was Malaysia is a claimant state on the South China Sea. Thailand, they're not on the South China Sea, so they're not going to be in conflict with China over maritime claims, right? So the problem with China saying, okay, we're going to take Scarborough Shoal, we're going to explore off the shore of Vietnam, is it makes other countries in the region, like Indonesia, think maybe we should worry more about China. And I think ever since then, Indonesia has been very wary of China's moves in the South China Sea with fishing and things like that, right? And so they were looking to see what Indonesia would do, right? So calling it the Natuna Sea, not the South China Sea, is one thing, right? Minister Susi was very, she was very clear about what she was communicating, right? So I think that's the kind of thing that we'll have to be paying attention to going forward.
I want to discuss more about geopolitics, but I know the time is not allowing us. So I would like to ask the last questions about the Georgetown, but I think, to the interest of the students here, I would like to give the publics to raise the questions, and then after that, I'll circle back to you on that questions. Okay. So, yeah, any questions? Okay, one, two, three. All right, and then I go to you, and then after that, I want to go to Ibu in front. Yeah, please.
Check. Okay. Thank you, Professor Yuhki. I have two questions. First, could you give some analysis on Indonesia's possible accessions to OECD? Proposal that might take 6 to 10 years long for countries such as Brazil, Argentina, and stuff, but also take as short as Chile for just 3 years. That's the first question. So possible accessions of Indonesia to OECD. Second, we are facing a major roadblock, which is the institutional paralysis of WTO appellate body. So basically, it's caused by U.S. blocking adjudications appointment by Trump and following by Biden administrations. However, we have this heated tensions between EU and also Indonesia that has reached critical juncture. We have like 5 disputes in total. So, but also the alternative that is proposed by EU, which is the multi-party interim appeal arbitrations agreement, or MPIA, doesn't solve anything. So how do you see and how do you analyze this geopolitical vortex? How Indonesia could escape from this prisoner dilemma? Yeah, thank you.
Let me collect another one and then I go back to you. Yes, Ibu.
Thank you, Professor Yuhki. My name is Desi, and actually, I just want to add because he also mentioned about the OECD ascension. So I just want to add a bit more. So right now, Indonesia is in the session in OECD, and the government have a really ambitious goal within 2 years. I want to ask you about what's your thought in this. Is it really possible? And what do you think Indonesia government is such in a rush to be a member of OECD? Because I think if it's like 5 or 6 years, it's more feasible because there's a lot of homework to be done. There's a lot of regulation in the OECD that we have to be put into laws and regulation before we become the member of OECD. So I want to ask your opinion about this. What do you think? Is it possible within 2 years? And then what do you think? Why is it Indonesian government is in a rush? And what do you think are the challenges and the aspect that we need to pay attention or the government need to pay attention during this accession process? Thank you.
So I have to admit that I'm not super familiar with the process of accession for OECD. But what I would say is, what is the reason for accession is, I think it's, there's some part that is optics, right? You get to say, oh, I'm part of this club, right? We're part of G20 now. We're part of OECD, right? We get to say we're part of these fora, right? So we can actually be part of the discussion, right? I think that is the extent of the value of it, to my mind. Much more important than sort of being classified in any particular way is actually the performance of the economy. So I actually think they shouldn't focus very much on things like that. That stuff will naturally come if you grow. So let's focus on the causes of growth. Going again back to total factor productivity, what are the ways you get that, right? You do that by rationalizing your bureaucracy. You do that by having the rule of law, right? You do that by educating your people, and you do that by incentivizing research, right? So do that first, and then OECD accession will come, right? Because when you grow so much that you become undeniable, right? Then you will be asked to be in the club, okay? So that's what I would say about that. And kind of related to the second question that you had, I would say that the larger you get, the more leverage you have, right? So China is able to basically say when they'll agree to international determinations and when they won't, right? So the Philippines filed an arbitration case against China in Scarborough Shoal. The Philippines won, but nothing happens because the facts on the ground are that China is the biggest military and economic force in the region, and they kind of determine what's going to happen, right? So again, Indonesia really should be focused on sort of, I think, getting the fundamentals right and making it, a bigger economy, which then creates a lot of, and then using that leverage, right? So the one case in which Indonesia really, in recent years, used its leverage very strategically was in the onshoring of nickel processing, right? As a way to move up the value chain. And what that does is you then move up in innovation. And that is a sign of TFP growth, okay? So that's what you want to be doing. But don't do it for everything, okay? You can only do that with nickel because Indonesia is the largest reserve of nickel. So you have leverage. If you do it in something that you don't have leverage, businesses will just go somewhere else, okay? So you have to be selective and understand what cards you're holding.
I think we're also feeling now the implications of, there's a good or bad, the implications of banning the nickels, because we know that now Indonesia is overflowing the global market with the nickels and making the nickels prices going down. I think that's also the homework of the next administration. Now I would like to open the second round of questions. Okay, there you go, and then this one. Okay, and then please.
Thank you, Professor Yuki. My name is Akbar. With the elected President Prabowo have a program of free food and free milk, right? And with his landslide victory in Indonesia, it also shows that our Indonesian people's populist approach and policy still to be still popular among the people. And I'm just curious, how do you see this and how it charts Indonesian economic? Because we know that this is also need a thick fiscal capacity, and with the global economic trajectory, is there any implication or direct influence towards this approach and policy? Thank you.
Then in front, yeah.
Thank you for the opportunity. Professor, you touched upon technology a bit earlier when we talked about economy. But there is one concern, a big concern for me and many of the young generation, especially when we see technology discourse is now still separated from the discourse on economy and geopolitics. And how do you see in the future as Indonesia or other developing countries when the level of playing fields are still different? You see in the global north, you talk about cybersecurity already, you talk about the higher advancement already, but here we're still talking about how technology can help the socioeconomic welfare, how it is being educated, and so on and so forth. So there's a big gap of playing fields, but at the same time, the discourse is still separated with the diplomacy, geopolitics discourse. So could you please elaborate on how do we move forward with this, especially as Indonesia?
Yeah, I think they're very interesting questions, both of them. Thank you. So the first one was about social policy, right? I think what you want to have in any economic policy is to think about what the incentives are for individual consumers and firms. Do you have an incentive to try to be more productive as a firm or as an individual? That will lead to overall growth for an economy. And growth is the number one way to reduce poverty, okay? So this is actually what China did. China and India are the two biggest cases in history of reducing poverty, And the way they did it was through growing the economy, right? Through TFP growth, okay? So that's what you want to do. Now, the way to do it, I think you have to have a few things. I actually agree with certain types of social policies. I believe in universal education. I believe, so you don't have to pay school fees if you're a student, right? Unfortunately, in Indonesia, we don't have that, right? Second thing is health, right? So they made the Jokowi administration did a very good job of providing insurance for everyone. I think that's a very good policy, right? Because ultimately, that's the well-being of your citizens. On food, though, just giving out food, I'm not sure that that provides the right incentives unless it's for a certain band of the population that needs it, right? So if the food subsidies are going to the wrong parts of society, then that don't need it, then that's not a good incentive, right? It's actually very wasteful. Actually, Indonesia has a form of this. It's BBM, right? Actually, the subsidy for gasoline, guess who uses it the most? The people with the big cars, not the Wong Chili, right? So that's the difference there. Who is benefiting the most? Think about how much money that a big SUV is getting in state subsidies that could be going to paying for the school fees of all of the poor children, right? That's the decision that I think needs to be made there, right? But my biggest answer to this is it depends on what the finance ministry does. The finance ministry's job is to set the parameters to say, you shouldn't spend this money because we don't have it, or if we do, we might repeat 1997. And that's the biggest risk to growth in Indonesia, right? Actually, when 1997 happened, poverty spiked by 30%. And we can't have that again, right? So how you avoid is really about having a minister that is willing to say to the president and everyone else, look, and other ministries, sorry, we don't have that money. Here is the budget constraint. And that's just the numbers, right? So that's what I would look out for. What was the second question?
The technology.
Technology and, right, the different levels, right, in the global north. And so, okay, so I actually think that technology is an opportunity for Indonesia. What is most appropriate for Indonesia is the key, though. You don't want to bring in technology that doesn't make sense for where the economy is, because that's where technology cannot be absorbed by companies very well or individuals. But what's nice about technology right now is it's very decentralized. So everyone has their smartphones up. These smartphones are very powerful instruments that can be used for all sorts of things, including disseminating information in ways that in 10, 15 years ago was not even a possibility. So actually using technology and adapting it to the Indonesian context at $5,000 GDP per capita is actually the way to go. Just don't do things like fusion reactors or something in Indonesia, but use consumer technologies that can sort of advance individuals and small firms here. That's actually how technology should be used. So make it sort of adapted to the context. Yeah.
Now, we still have time for one round. If you have any questions, you can raise your hand. No? Okay. I will use my liberty as a moderator to ask another two questions before the Georgetown. We talk about the investments before, talk about technology. I would like to link it up to the investment. And as you know, in investment, there's always a debate between intensive investment and a labor intensive investment. It's always a debate which between. And labor intensive is more political popular and compared to the capital intensive investment, which also related to link up to the technology. How we are dancing in these two, right? In order to push up our economy to become not only an upper middle income country, but also an advanced economy.
So in the long run, you want to have an economy that becomes capital intensive. But in the short term, what that means is that you will have people who get displaced by technology. And we see this in every country right now through AI and automation and things like that, right? In rich countries, middle income countries, low income countries. It's happening at a pace that's faster than ever before. And what that's doing is it's really creating a lot of people in a short period of time who may be out of a job until they can figure out, okay, what can I do next in this new economy? And that's where I think that's one of the reasons why we have a rise in populism, because there is this sort of uncertainty that or anxiety where people think, oh, am I going to be out of a job? Or maybe I'm already out of a job because there's a new sort of technology out there, right? Think about Grab, right? And Gojek, how that's changed things, right? The taxi companies are sort of having to adjust, right? So there's always in the short term that kind of issue, right? I always think about whether a new technology is able to democratize its access, right? So sometimes technologies sort of concentrate wealth into some people's hands. I think that's what we've seen over the last several years with the rise of things like Amazon and others, right? But actually, about 25 years ago, the internet actually created a new class of jobs like IT workers. And that was democratizing sort of the benefits of technology. So I think, that's what I would like to see, right? Is, to the extent that wealth doesn't get concentrated by the people who are first. That's what the problem has been over the last several years, I think. The first one to get to this type of app, they get to take everything, right? And then everyone else sort of is a user and feeds that one person or individual, right? And that type of thing is not sustainable, I think, right?
Last questions. Last year, President Jokowi was at your campus and announced possible opening up Georgetown branch in Indonesia. Would be the first American university. As we know, we have a lot of Australian campuses now in Indonesia, and you'll be the first. Tell me more about the plan, so everybody can inform about that.
So as I mentioned, I'm the director of the Asian Studies program in the School of Foreign Service. Prior to me were two very famous professors, Mike Green and Victor Cha, experts on Japan and Korea, respectively. But they were sort of focused on Northeast Asia. In my heart, I'm focused on Southeast Asia and Indonesia in particular. So in June of 2022, Minister Nadiem asked my dean, Dean Hellman, who spent 6 years in Indonesia as the chief governance advisor of the World Bank from 2002 until 2008 or so. Okay, so he helped lead the World Bank's response to the tsunami in Aceh. I actually worked at the World Bank during that time, working with GAM. So I spent over a year in Aceh working on research following Mantan GAM in the villages, interviewing them, trying to figure out what they were doing in their economy. Okay, so Minister Nadiem asked Dean Hellman, would you consider setting up a branch of Georgetown University in Indonesia? And he said, I don't know, I should ask the director of Asian Studies. So he asked me to look at it. And so, of course, I leapt on that chance and haven't let it go since. So what it looks like is the School of Foreign Service, we're proud to say, is the #1 ranked school for international affairs in the world. We are at the top. We're over Harvard, Princeton, Yale, etc. for international affairs. We take advantage of our location in Washington because it's a center of international affairs. We have another campus in Doha, Qatar. So that covers the Gulf. And Qatar is very involved in diplomacy in that region. The future and the present of Asian diplomacy is here in Jakarta, especially with the US-China relationship going badly, but also because Japan and China, they don't get along either. Everyone gets along with Indonesia. And ASEAN is becoming very important in diplomacy as a result. So it's a very natural thing to have, idea to have the School of Foreign Service be based in Washington, but have a branch in Jakarta. And the idea is we would have our master's programs, and we have different master's programs. We have the most ambassadors that are trained by any university is ours, is the School of Foreign Service. We have multiple heads of state, so President Bill Clinton, President Gloria Arroyo, King Abdullah of Jordan, King Felipe of Spain, and many other leaders are graduates of Georgetown. And so what we want to do is train the next generation of leaders from Indonesia, but also the ASEAN region, by having them take master's programs in Washington for the first year. And then for those students who want to get a specialization in Southeast Asia, the second year they come out to Jakarta. And so they get credit the same way that they would do it if they're back home, back in main campus, okay? But the experience that we would have for our students is very special in our Jakarta branch. And what it looks like is we have these things called policy labs. So policy labs are where professors will ask the different policy makers in Jakarta, at the World Bank, at USAID, at the Indonesian government ministries, all of these different policymakers, or at World Resources Institute, on questions like, how do you stop deforestation? How do you decrease poverty? How do you think about diplomacy in the region? Okay, professors will then design research, and the master's students that come from in their second year, and we'll want to recruit Indonesian students. So please think about Georgetown to apply there. Okay, and we are on the LPDP list, by the way. So it would be free. Okay, I just need to get that in. Thank you, Dino. The students who come to this program, we will send you alongside the professors, including myself, to the field where we're gonna conduct research together. Okay, so students who are interested in fighting deforestation will go to the palm oil plantations. We'll go to the rainforest and collect data. Students who are interested in poverty alleviation will go to the villages and learn about what exactly is causing poverty. How do we sort of eradicate it? Okay? And then we bring that data back and we present it to the World Bank. We present it to Bapenas or different ministries. We then will produce research. So the students who go through this, they'll get this immersive experience. They learn how to do research. They'll learn to engage with policymakers. But most importantly, they'll get an intuition for what the problems are of Indonesia and the Global South. And this is actually what a lot of our current master's students are very excited to do, is they want to also come to Indonesia. And my second objective, besides helping sort of with the Indonesian higher education space, is I want to have a new generation of Americans and other non-Indonesians who know a lot about Indonesia. Right now, so many people in other countries know so little about Indonesia, even though it's the fourth largest country in the world. So we want to completely change that. And so that's what we're trying to do. And we were so honored that we were able to host President Jokowi And we actually, one of the main things that we did, this happened right after Gaza blew up, and there were some concerns. What should we, actually there were some questions. Would it make sense from President Jokowi's team? Should he even come and meet with Biden, right? And so what I said to the ambassador, I said, Georgetown has invested for many years in interreligious dialogue. We have a campus in Qatar for this very reason. And so, in fact, Georgetown is the only US university with a full mosque on it. It's a beautiful space. And I said to the ambassador, why don't we bring President Jokowi to the mosque after he gives his speech? And so when he gave the speech, we walked him over to the mosque, and he did his prayers. And it was really a meaningful way to show, look, this is what interreligious dialogue looks like. Because Georgetown is a Jesuit university, but on our university, we have a full-service mosque. And this is something that I think is very special about our university, is we really prize that. And that's why we've set up in Qatar. It's also why we want to look to build here. So our timeline on this is we want to have the space open by this fall, and hopefully have our second-year master's students, so the master's students who are currently in Washington, next year they would come to Indonesia, right? But what I want is for more Indonesians to apply to the School of Foreign Service, okay? To go for free, okay? And go there. And in fact, we have some alumni who can tell you about their experience. But what it would do, it would sort of really open up the world for both non-Indonesians and Indonesians. And this is what we want to do. And the last thing I'll say is when President Jokowi announced it in November, he said, this is the first time I've spoken at an American university. And he said, alasan saya pertama karena itu universitas bagus, top. Kedua, karena akan ada cabang di Indonesia tahun depan. Semoga tidak mundur, right? And so because he said semoga tidak mundur, we can't fail that. And so with that, please, we're almost there. We have a few hurdles left, but please be on the lookout. So thank you very much.
I shouldn't have switched to Indonesian. Why should I speak English the whole time? You speak bahasa very well.
Nggak apa-apa, santai aja.
All right. So just want to check how many you want to sign up to Georgetown next year? Anyone want to sign up? All right. So join me to thank Professor Tajima. Thank you again. Let's give a big hand for him. Thank you again. Thank you. Give it back to the MC, please.
And with that, ladies and gentlemen, our wonderful discussion have come to an end. We'd like to thank Professor Yuhki, Georgetown University, Kak Alvin, and all of the participants who joined today. Before we close, we'd like to invite Prof. Yuhki and Kak Alvin to please stand in the middle of the stage to take a group photo. And Padino as well. All right, thank you everyone for coming today, and we'll see you in our next event.